From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Stephanie Peatling. It's Tuesday, April the 25th. The Australian economy is being broken by a dysfunctional housing system that is inflicting long-term financial and community pain on almost every part of the nation. Decades of bad policies, greed, NIMBYism and population growth have enabled the economy to be consumed by the great Australian dream. So has Australians' love affair with housing so distorted the economy that it is at the heart of the problems plaguing our cities, our governments and our very way of life? Today, economics correspondents Shane Wright and Rachel Clun on how housing ate the Australian economy. Shane and Rachel, it's no secret that house prices in Australia have skyrocketed over the last few decades. But I'm hoping that we can start this discussion by painting a picture of the housing market over just the past few years. How big has the growth in the industry been, and what kind of costs are we talking about for consumers?
Well, where do we start? The fifth most indebted households in the developed world, an increase in median house prices 5, 6, 7 times the rate of inflation over the last 20 years. A median house price in Sydney of, let's say, got to 1.4 million during COVID. It's come down a little bit. Canberra, surrounded by fields and kangaroos, has a median house price of $1 million. You saw the biggest lift in housing prices through COVID since the late 1980s. And we've got to a point, that to get into the housing market, you need a deposit that you can't jump over, and you will need to service it with 30 to 40% of your income. It's a terrible situation.
Rachel, it's not just a matter of people who want to buy houses, is it? Renting is also a basket case, I think we could call it.
It is absolutely a basket case. You know, I think the median weekly rent in Sydney for a 3-bedroom home in the inner city is now $1,000. In Melbourne, it's, about, I think, $750 a week. Rental inflation last year was 4.8%, but advertised rents are skyrocketing, well above 20%, which means that rents are going to be high and keep getting higher for years to come, according to Reserve Bank research at least.
We're talking about a problem that has been decades in the making, essentially. Let's try and go back to look at some of the causes of this that have been going on for quite some time. Shane, is there a real starting point to when all of this started to go bad?
We can go way back and probably into the 1960s, where you see support at the government level for assistance for first home buyers. Now, at the time, the states and the federal government had more supply of housing than population growth. So at the time, states were really building a lot of housing. You get into the 1980s, financial deregulation comes along. So up until this point, the federal government effectively set what mortgage rates were. The banks were so strict on their lending that if you wanted to buy a house, you actually had to have a good deposit. It really restricted how many people were coming into the market. Come along to the mid-90s, non-bank lenders start hitting the market. So the banks had big margins on their mortgages and they start getting competition from non-bank lenders. You also have tax changes, negative gearing, and off we go to the races. There's a whole confluence of these events that really accelerate. And it's not just here, there's a few other events. The financial deregulation globally really leads to people sinking more and more money into housing, and there's also the rise of the NIMBYs, which really takes off as well.
Rach, the NIMBYs, we love to hate them, don't we?
So NIMBYs. NIMBY stands for Not In My Backyard. Essentially it means people who are okay with development as long as it's not next door or across the road.
They love to hate development. They're a red button issue at the moment, but it really does go to show that federal governments are not entirely to blame for the problems that have been coming on in the housing industry. It's at a whole of government level, isn't it? It's state governments and local governments and residents themselves.
Totally. And it was really interesting talking to Michael Sukar, the Coalition Housing spokesman and former housing minister, about some of these issues. You know, he's essentially saying that it's very easy for the federal government to say, well, you know, we need to build more homes, but it becomes a more tricky political issue when you go to state government, and then even trickier when you go to local government. Well, when you have rate-paying constituents who say, I don't want this big development here, as a council, their interest is the people paying them, which is their ratepayers. They're not necessarily going to be so concerned about future ratepayers. So it's a really tricky issue, and it does require governments of all levels to come together and figure out where they're going to build new houses, and having data about how many people we're going to have coming into Australia or forming new households is a really key part of that, to know where you need to build.
And population growth is a huge part of it, isn't it, Shane? And it's not just population growth that comes about from people having babies. A large part of the problem is people coming in from overseas, isn't it, who are adults, so they need immediately somewhere to live, not a baby who just lives at home with mum and dad for quite some time.
Well, and even now they don't stay.
Well, that's true.
They can't afford to leave home. But really, the fertility rate has been falling over the last 15 years, ever since the GFC. So, yeah, you're right. It's not babies, but, yeah, a fully formed human coming into the country. Population growth is a real key part of it, because most migrants in this country want to live in Sydney or Melbourne. Like, they really draw people in. But it's not the only issue, because if you look at, say, through COVID, like 2020 and 2021, there was no population growth. And what happened? House prices went through.
Population growth due to immigration.
No, there was no there was even the number of babies. We actually saw a dip in that space, and we actually had a lift in the number of people dying. But this also gets on to the size of the households, which I know Wright has been watching really closely as well.
Yeah, it was really interesting. The Reserve Bank has done some research into how households have shrunk. So I think, household size has been falling for quite some time as we get older, and more older people end up living by themselves. But during the pandemic, the number of people per household fell below 2.5 for the first time ever. That created, the Reserve Bank estimates, about 120,000 new households, just that shrinking in household size. So people looking for a bit more space or not wanting to live with 5 housemates anymore during the pandemic really affected how many houses we had. And they don't know what's going to happen there, whether people stay in those bigger spaces by themselves or whether they'll be forced back into big share houses because prices are too much.
And Rach, what about the role of interest rates? I mean, we've just come through a period of extraordinarily low rates, the likes of which we probably won't see again in our lifetimes. Does that mean that the bubble will burst at some point? Is there some hope on that front?
I don't think the economy can afford the bubble to burst. So much of everything that goes into the Australian economy relies on housing. 10% of Australian jobs are in building and construction in some way or another. The mortgages held by banks are such a large proportion of their books. We can't afford as a country for the property bubble to burst. And it just means that essentially, prices have come down a little bit from the peak of the pandemic, but they're not going to crash to levels that we saw in the past. So I think we can expect house prices to be high and out of reach for a lot of people forever.
I think this goes to a broader point for the whole series, and that is, like, we've written all about housing because of how it's distorting the entire economy. It's affecting productivity, it's affecting the number of kids that are being born, that the problems that are evident in the economy and which governments of all persuasions want to deal with, this isn't an elephant in the room. This is a pachyderm herd just sitting out in the lounge room watching the TV. There's no space.
So given that the problems affect pretty much everyone, why isn't more being done to solve it? Why can't we get to a place where we agree that change is needed and work out what those changes have to be? I
feel like it comes down to NIMBYs in a way.
It's all about NIMBYs, says Rach. Big call.
We're happy for more development, but as long as it's not here. And I think that problem then spreads to the local councils who are like, well, we want development as long as it's not in our council area. And then it's a problem from state governments and it's a problem for the federal government. What the Housing Minister, Julie Collins, is doing with the Housing Accord is actually quite interesting. If she can get an agreement between all of the states and territories and the local councils on where they're going to build homes into the future, I think that's a step towards fixing the problem. But it's a very difficult problem to solve when you don't want a development next to you.
Shane, while we all feel that NIMBYs are not, perhaps serving Australia's best interests, there is an issue of supply, isn't there? There were figures that we've highlighted in the series about just how slow the rate of building new dwellings in Australia is, surely that can't be all up to the NIMBYs. Surely we can't blame them for all of that. There does seem to be general inertia at the state and local government areas to actually get the number of dwellings, whether they're flats, townhouses or houses, actually coming through the system at the rate that we need them. Is that just about a shortage of land?
We are the only country that is a continent. I'm not convinced that we have a shortage of land. We have a shortage of where we want to live. And so there is this whole theory that more than half of all Australians live in 3 cities: Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane. If I go to Britain, which has between 60 and 70 million people, it's about 9, 10 cities that have more than half their population. If I go to the United States, 330 million people, you're into the about 30 cities. We really, really want to live in Sydney, Melbourne or Brisbane. That is a problem. I think Phil Lowe has talked about this, saying, we've decided to put a lot of our money into housing, and it's money in 3 particular cities. During COVID, we saw that people will move out of the major cities, but for some reason, like that looks like that's been arrested and that people are coming back into our cities. So there is one argument that perhaps we need to spend a lot more on housing and a lot more in regional or non-Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane areas to try and take some pressure off, because supply is one thing, and that will take changes to council laws, for instance. It'll take changes to state planning laws. I think there's a real case for the federal government to offer incentives to either the state governments or local councils. If you build more homes, if you change your planning laws, we will give you cash. Joe Biden's administration did this same thing just a week ago. And this whole idea of trying to free up, get a financial incentive in place. And I write economics, as does Wright. We understand financial incentives are really key drivers. Perhaps that's one way to do it.
Let's end on a positive note. We've also put forward some solutions in the series that we've produced. What is the way out of this problem, Rachel? What is it going to take to fix it?
Well, I think, as Shane just pointed to, handing states or local governments cash to change their planning laws and encourage more development. So say it's a case of, well, if you agree to build this new suburb, we'll fund the roads or we'll fund the schools in that area, so there's infrastructure connecting it. I think that is really vital. Another really big solution is we need some change to renting. So at the moment, it's just mum and dad investors mostly who own 1 or 2 properties. The government is already doing some work in the space to encourage more institutional investment from, say, superannuation funds to get more rental properties into the market. That's going to be a really important issue, fixing some of that rental market tension.
Shane, one last point. Capital gains tax, negative gearing. Will we ever see attempts to reform those again?
Not in the near future. They do have an impact, and I think even the Reserve Bank concedes, yes, they do have a marginal impact, but I don't think it's the cure-all. I think the cure-all is actually a change in Australians' mindsets, and that is a very big bridge to cross, and I'm not convinced we're going to get there. You wanted to be upbeat, but I'm sorry, I've had to crush you there on that front.
Thanks for joining me today, Shane and Rachel.
Thanks, Steph.
Lovely.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Julia Carr-Katzel. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Stephanie Peatling. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.